I know that a few of our viewers have said they have had some problems while they were trying to make comments. Let me pause that. Said they had some problems trying to get their accounts to allow them to make comments. Before we get our class started, we still got a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to take a second and try to see if we couldn't help to kind of overcome some of that problem. If you're logged into YouTube right now, what you'll notice is that YouTube requires you to have a Google account. And if you notice up here on the far right corner, in this area right here, you can access your account. Now, if you don't have a Google account, it's easy to set one up, but I don't have the screen to set that up. But what you would need to do then is in YouTube, you would click on this, and that brings up your account, and you'll go to manage your Google account. And when you've clicked on that, it takes you to your statistics for your account. And one of the reasons you're not able sometimes to make comments in our chat is because you don't have in your personal information on the far left a name to make that comment under. The system doesn't want just random comments. It wants to specify who is making comments. So it requires for you to click on this personal information on the left and to go down and to fill out the area for your name. Now mine is already filled out here, so you can see my name there, but if you don't have any information there, you would click on the arrow here, and that would take you to a place where, clicking on the pin right here, you could then put in your name. And that seems to be the main issue as to why some people are struggling to make their comments in YouTube. So hopefully if that's your problem, you're able to fix it with that solution. My mic is off, so you can't hear me. A lot of people wish they could fix that themselves. It's so good to have all of you here. I see we got a lot of people in our area watching our video tonight. We're so very excited because we're starting a new class tonight. And our new class is going to be on the subject of Bible families. What this is meant to be is a survey of various families that are found in the Bible, trying to understand different ways that we're supposed to spiritually behave in a family setting. And so tonight we're going to be going back to the very first of the Bible families in Genesis chapter 4. I'd like you to get your Bibles out and go with me, if you would, over to Genesis chapter 4. And we're going to be looking there here in just a couple of moments, and I'll put those passages up for us to read them together as well, but sometimes it's just easier to see it in your own Bible. If you are tuning in and you're not familiar with how we typically handle things, we tend to put our class materials on our website. Here's a attachment of our website, which is www.sunsetchurchofchrist.net. This is our main page. You might have got to our live stream through here. You can see that that's been added here in the moment. Under our resources section, what we have here are our different classes. Tonight's classes is under topical studies, Bible families. I'm probably going to move that up to the central area under current studies. I mistakenly put it in the wrong place, but this is Bible families. And when you click on that, it's going to bring you to our first class handout tonight so that you can look at that as we share these things together. Going to be reading now from the book of Genesis, chapter 4, and we're going to be reading a story, an account that we're all very familiar with, but we'll look at this together so that we can kind of put some thoughts that we're going to have. I'll be throwing some questions. Actually, I'll probably ask Gregor. He's been really good to help me to throw some of our questions out into our chat area as well, just in case you want to think about those questions ahead of time. But we're going to go ahead and take a look at Genesis chapter 4. We're going to read verses 1 through 11. Now Adam knew his wife knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Verse 10, and he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened his mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. You know, this is one of those moments a lot of times where we kind of ask those Bible questions that people think they know the answer to and they don't. How did Cain kill Abel? A lot of people say it was with a rock. I don't know if I might have even said that once or twice. But of course, if you go back and look, it actually doesn't tell us how this happened. A lot of very interesting things in that account, right? A lot of important things too. In fact, a lot of times we'll use this record as a way to talk about the idea of keeping yourself in self-control and your emotions in check, and what happens when people can't control their emotions. And that's a pretty serious point. That word countenance is an important word. It means like your emotional stability. And if you don't control your emotional stability, the Bible repeatedly tells us you're in great danger. You're in danger of falling into sin. And that's an important idea that all of us want to try to understand, that we don't want to stray into that. But there's a couple of points here that I want to pull out when we talk about the things that I want to talk about here about the family. And in fact, as we've been saying, this is the purpose of our class, is to talk about Bible families and try to get an idea of how families go. And the first thing I want you to consider is this: where does a family begin? Now, I would suggest to you that perhaps the family didn't begin in Genesis chapter 4, but instead the family began before this, back in Genesis chapter 2, because there God, after having created Eve, taking her out of Adam and creating her, made a statement, the following statement, Genesis 2 and verse 24, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So this is a real important statement, right? You know that. You've heard it many times. But it's super important for a couple of reasons. For one thing, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about marriage here and how this passage opens up the idea of what marriage is all about. But it also actually begins a definition of family, because it talked about children, didn't it? It talked about people who leave their father and mother. So there's the father and mother, there's the child, the son, who leaves to form his own marriage. And it actually kind of establishes the idea of how a family's meant to work. A family's meant to work by change, by things moving apart and coming apart. And maybe we'll come back to that here in just a moment. But there's a couple of ideas here as we start talking about the idea of marriage. And the first one is, well, let's talk about marriage itself here. Let's try to understand exactly how marriage itself is established. A couple of questions that you see there before you, and Gregor put those out for us already. First of all, the question is, what is an institution? We use that word a lot, right? We say, the institution of this or the institution of that, word we use a lot of times. What is an institution? I want you to think about that for a second, because it's actually an important question. Debbie Watkins gives us our first answer. Debbie, I appreciate it. She says an institution sets the parameters for an organization or an institution. It also sets the rules for an institution. So Debbie, let's play with what you said there a second. That's a good answer. An institution is something that has rules. It has a definition or a structure set up to it. You know, we always say marriage is an institution that you have to be committed to. We also say an insane asylum is an institution you have to be committed to. But let's not put those two things together. But think about this for a second. When you talk about an institution like that, you're still talking about a place with rules. You're talking about something that has a structure. And so an institution is something that's set aside by itself. And I see I've got Anna Willis answered. I don't know if that's Anna that answered that. Anna, you're going to get credit for it. Institution is an established law, practice, or custom. That's actually that's nearly a dictionary type definition. That's great because it established the idea of rules and practices that people have to abide by. So an institution has a lot of different ideas that can be put into this, and that's an important thing. It can be a pretty broad idea. Let me ask a couple of questions here. To that end, what other institutions has God created? Think about this for a second. With that word we use a lot, we're talking here that God created marriage. And what other institutions has God created? Think about a couple of those for a second. What are some of those institutions? You might be thinking of some, like I said, certain things that they have rules and how they're supposed to behave and conduct themselves. What other institutions can you think of? I can think of course, marriage. Anna throws out the idea of the gospel, and how about Anna? Let me take that a different direction and say, how about the church itself? The church itself is an institution. Anthony throws one out here. He throws out the Lord's Supper as an institution, and it is because it has rules. It has a structure to it, and so that's an important idea. Debbie throws out another institution that God established: government. Romans chapter 13 says that. Boy, you guys picked up all the ones I wanted you to pick up. I wanted you to say government. Great. I wanted you to talk about the things like the church and the Lord's Supper. Great. You know, the works of the church could be called institutions too. Anything with rules, and it has a structure. Now, Luis reminds us family is an institution. Right on, Luis. Family is also an institution, meaning there are rules. There's a structure that's been created and established there. Let me add one more question to this. Gregor threw it up there, and let's think about this one more time. How do different institutions that God created interact with each other? Now, I guess this is one of those times, you know me well enough to know, a lot of times I ask questions where I know what the answer I want is, and you have to kind of figure out what on earth is he talking about here. But what I'm kind of asking here is, how does an institution like government work with an institution like marriage? Or how does an institution like the church work with an institution like marriage? And I don't know if you really can see where I'm trying to go with this idea. Maybe I'll ask it a different way. Does government get to decide how the institution of marriage operates? Does the church define how the institution of marriage operates? Does marriage define the church or the government? Or does the church define government? What's the idea of these different institutions? Monique throws a great point. She says, hey, if they're all under the authority of God, they're all governed by God's word. And the important point is they don't each exercise that authority. Thanks, Lamar. Because what we're going to is they don't exercise authority over each other. One of the important ideas that we need to understand is that marriage isn't overseen by the church. Now, there are, Lamar points to the Word of God and says, here's God's Word, and it establishes, Monique points to this too, here's God's Word, and it establishes how these things act. But God didn't just kind of stack them on top of each other, where he had the church's authority first, and the government second, and then the marriage third, and each one oversees the other. They're each independent of each other. They're separate from each other. So the church doesn't create marriage. Church doesn't destroy marriage. The church doesn't create government. It doesn't control government, and vice versa. So that's an important idea to understand. It's important to understand because the sense here is that when these organizations are set like this, there's been churches in the past that have claimed that marriage is a sacrament of the church. Not true. There have been churches in the past that have tried to control governments and get governments to submit to them. Not appropriate. When God creates these institutions set by themselves. They're under God's authority, but they are each distinct by themselves. You need to understand that's an important thing for us to understand. Ben Willis throws us a comment, one man, one woman. Oh, I'm sorry. Ben's actually going to our next question. And that next question is important as we consider these things. The next question is, how does God define marriage? In this verse in particular, Ben, you're right. Ben said it exactly. He said it's one man and one woman. One man and one woman. And it's important to understand that because first and foremost, this idea rules out a lot of the different teachings that people have had, both all the way, in ancient times and now. One man, one woman. It rules out polygamy, some of the things that were practiced in the Old Testament. It rules out homosexual marriage. It rules out divorce. God makes this statement about the definition of what he creates in marriage. And we're probably all understanding that when God gives us this definition, what he's also doing is to tell us that this is something that only he has the right to establish and to create. In fact, whenever Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 19 and he's talking about marriage and he's giving us his rules on marriage, you'll note that Jesus said in verse 4, going back to what Ben said there a second ago, he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, one man, one woman? For this reason, Jesus goes on to say, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Let me ask you a question here. As Jesus gave us the law of marriage, we're under the law of Christ today, so that's the law of marriage that we're under today. Did Jesus substantially change anything? Did he add anything or subtract anything from what he said there? Did he do something where it was changed? We have a couple of different ways of thinking of this, which is to say, it means you're probably not going to be wrong whichever way you add to this, because first of all, Jesus, of course, is just restating the law of marriage that is given to us in Genesis chapter 2. That when Jesus says, here's my law of marriage, he's just going back to the beginning. At the same time, you might take a notice that whenever he continues to think about this or elaborates on this, he just gives us a little more detail to it. For example, what he says there is that he says that this is something that God has created and that man is not to separate. Rob kind of picks up on something. Rob makes a point to see that here is what God says, verse 6, they're no longer two but one flesh. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Rob makes the point here in the chat. He says, that implies the idea of no divorce. Well, that was there from the beginning, but at the same time, Jesus is making it very clear. Jesus is making this the idea of something that can't be changed. So you guys are picking this up right. I got another comment here from a woman very dear to my heart, Aline Haynes. And she says an institution is something that is instituted. It's created. It has a point of origin, and usually would say it has an authorized point of origin too. That's a good point to say that. Rob reminds us there, but back in Genesis chapter 2, when he establishes this, he says this is something that society cannot change. Now, Jesus is correcting something. Lamar makes a point there to say Jesus corrected their thought in verse 7 that Moses commanded divorce. Lamar, I'm going to jump back to there because that's a real good point to consider. That they say, why did Moses command, is the word that Lamar points our attention to, command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away. Well, one of the things to consider here too is the idea that when Jesus is doing away with the law of Moses, he's doing away with multiple parts of the law of Moses. The divorce under the law of Moses is going to be very different from divorce in the law of Christ, and that's an important point to understand as well. So it's good for us to think about how marriage was defined very specifically here, how God defined marriage, and that Jesus really isn't adding to anything from that first law of marriage, but he is elaborating and making it clear it's God who creates marriage. And that's the idea that we want to grab as we consider these things. The next thing I want us to consider, the next section that we're looking at, is to consider the idea that what we're getting revealed here is that one of the purposes of the home is to prepare people for marriage. I know we don't always think of it like that, because a lot of times what we're thinking about is the idea that marriage is something that we go off on our own and prepare ourselves on our own for marriage and how that's going to be. And yet what we're supposed to see is that when God gave us that command there in Genesis chapter 2, he was talking about how the family was a part of this process. The family, it infers, or you could say it leads us to conclude, the family is the thing that prepares a man or a woman for marriage. What is the home about? Well, this isn't everything that the home is about, but one of the big things that the home is about is preparing people for marriage. You might say it like this. It's the idea that when God gave the law, in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, God gave the laws of nature where he said every kind is to come after its own kind. And one of the things about that is that law also applies to Christianity. Every kind, Christ produces its own kind. So Christ produces disciples of Christ. But marriage is meant to produce, or it's hoped to produce, another marriage eventually, by creating children that then grow up, that are then launched into the world prepared for marriage. So one of the big ideas that we want to consider is, if marriage is designed in this purpose, marriage is designed, or family is designed for this purpose, family is designed to change. Family is designed to change. It's not designed to stay the same all the time. It's not designed to always have mom and dad and kids. It's designed as a purpose of growing something and producing something that then changes. And so that brings us to our question, maybe the most important question we're going to ask tonight. The question is, how do we do this? How do we do this? How do we, if we're a family, prepare children for marriage? I'll tell you what, since not all of us have children, not all of us are married, and in that circumstance, we'll also kind of say, how do we, as a congregation, prepare people for marriage? There's a lot of good answers here. I'm seeing some great answers in our chat right now. One of those is from George Watkins. George says, one way is to teach our children to love God, others, and ourselves, using God's definition of love. George, what a great answer. Because a lot of times, I think if somebody said, how do you prepare yourself for marriage? They might focus on worldly principles of marriage, when in fact, the person who's the most or the best prepared for marriage is the person who loves God the most. I've often told people who are single that the kind of person you need to find is somebody who loves God more than they love you. Because if you find the person who loves God more than they love the person they're going to marry, they're actually going to be the best spouse that they could be for that person. Now, George said they're going to love God, they're going to love others, which, of course, we understand being a disciple of Christ is about loving others. But George even added they're going to love themselves. George, that's a great comment. I wish I could spend a little more time in. Because the idea of being prepared for marriage, a large part of that is knowing how to appropriately love myself. Most people don't do that appropriately. In 1 Peter chapter 3, as it talks about the concept of a husband, it talks about the idea of how it is. I'm sorry, not Hebrews, 1 Peter 3, that's a different marriage passage. Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul is talking, and he says that a man who loves his wife loves himself. And it implies the idea that you have to know how to love yourself if you want to be properly prepared for marriage. A lot of advice I've given to people who aren't married yet too is that they shouldn't even pursue marriage unless they have a right view of themselves, because they're probably not going to pick the right person. That if they don't have that right affection for themselves, they're not going to pick the person that they need to choose. So George is right. One of the big ideas of the family, preparing children to grow into marriage, is they have to prepare them to love the Lord, to love others, to love themselves. That was a fantastic comment. Debbie's got another great comment. She says they have to be examples, or the examples they set are important. Absolutely. One of the biggest things we want to say is that the examples in the home of the functioning of the family tend to be the pattern that people then go forth and replicate. Every kind after its own kind, but if it's not the right kind, it doesn't reproduce the right kind a lot of times. It doesn't mean it's a guarantee. I want you to understand that. In fact, one of the big lessons we're going to learn as we study Bible families is sometimes good people don't produce, good children. That's an important idea about the Bible family. But examples are important because one of the biggest ways we learn is by observing others, by observing the things that we need to see in others. Lamar goes on to add to that. He says, by being a living example of how to treat our spouse and love them as Christ loved the church. Right there. That's a fantastic statement, Lamar, because what you're actually pointing to is back to that passage in Ephesians chapter 5, where the language of God's command to a husband, there's the institutional requirement of it. It's a commandment. There's a rule expected of you. That the command there for marriage establishes the idea that a man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church. And Lamar says we're supposed to be the living example of that love. That's a fantastic comment. Lamar, fantastic comment. Here's another one. Gregor's got a great comment. Show the value of marriage. It is not a test. It is a commitment. Gregor, I think that's a fantastic statement because I think a lot of times the reason marriages, and I'm going to be careful to say this is just a very bland generalism, but a lot of times marriages aren't successful when people aren't committed to the idea of the value of marriage itself. In other words, we marry somebody and we believe that the strength of our marriage is our commitment to that other person. But a lot of times the real strength of marriage is a commitment to marriage itself. Because what's going to happen over time with people? You marry somebody and what's likely to happen? Well, you're going to find out that they're just a human being and they have flaws and they're not perfect and they're problematic and they're troubling. And sometimes it's going to be the case. We use that term. It's a terrible term, fall in love. And we say, well, I fell in love. And then we say, well, I fell out of love. Well, feelings are going to change. In fact, what did I say a second ago? The marriage is a organization designed for change, and feelings change. If people aren't committed to the institution of marriage and the institution of the home, there's not going to be success. If we just think we're committing to the people in that institution, we've got it all wrong. We need to be committed to the idea of the institution itself. Gregor, that's a great comment for us to consider. Now let's go back and consider as we move on here some more of the things that we're thinking about. I want to go next to the idea in point number 3 of our handout there, that when God questions Cain as to his brother's whereabouts, Cain's response is to say, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper? Oh, I got one more comment there. Samantha gave me a comment. Sometimes the comments come in a little late. I always want you to make them anyway. I'll try to get back to them. Samantha throws it out there. Parents train and then release or let go of the children. Samantha, that is a great term. I'm going to say this. Release your children. Children are catch and release, it seems like. That's a great comment. But you're right. We're not really supposed to keep them. Samantha, you understand something that it took me a long time to understand, that the goal of the home is not to keep our kids. The goal of the home is, it's frankly to get them out, but to get them out accomplished to the things that they need to do. Samantha, great comment. I appreciate that statement. But let's go back here for a moment and consider under our point number 3, when God was questioning Cain, Cain told him, am I my brother's keeper? And I want to consider for a second that maybe there's something really important to that statement. That for the first time, and we're early on in the history of mankind, but for the first time we're being told that perhaps one of the big ideas of the family is the care it's supposed to have for one another. That the way that expression is made, as Cain says there, am I my brother's keeper, that perhaps the point is that God is relating that there is an expectation. By asking him, there is an expectation that indeed I am my brother's keeper. Well, I tell you what, if it's not entirely clear there, we know that throughout the rest of the New Testament, or the Old Testament and New Testament, time and time again, there's an expression, there are terms found that relate how important it is that family takes care of its own. Look at this passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5. And Gregor's got a question up there for you to consider about this verse. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, there's an important statement made. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I'm going to come back to that question here in just a second, but I want you to tell me, what is a household? What do you see a household as? And maybe there's a narrow definition you might think about, and maybe there's a broad definition you might think about too. But what is the idea of a household? Well, one of the things I want to think about is the idea that from here on in the Bible, the concept is going to be relayed to us that families are supposed to show a care and concern for one another, that that's the right and proper way a family is to behave. Let me throw some examples at you if I can here for just a second. First of all, let's consider, how about Manoah and Samson? And I would have put Manoah's wife. Actually, Manoah's wife is such a person, but she's not named. Isn't that kind of frustrating or interesting? Manoah, of course, is Samson's father. And whenever the angel comes and tells them that they're going to have a child, and Manoah's wife, she couldn't have children. And we talked about this in our study in Judges. What an incredible moment this was. What did Manoah and his wife do? They said, let's ask the angel, how do we raise this child? That's the most important question any parent can ever ask. How do I raise this child in the Lord? That was what Manoah and his wife are asking. This is probably one of the most important chapters to talk about parenting, is to talk about the moment when Manoah and his wife find out they're going to have a son. And the care they're going to have for their son. We read in the next chapter. They're the ones that are finding him a wife. So they're helping him even after he's an adult. They're even the ones, kind of the sad part, they're even the ones that bury him at the end of his life, the Bible says. So that affection, that partaking in his life was something that they were all involved in. It wasn't like Samson hit 18 and he's gone and we have no care for him anymore. We see a consistent relationship of care involved there, a consistent relationship of how it was that people were looking out for one another. Here's another one to consider. How about children and the relationship they're supposed to have with their parents or even their grandparents? I use both terms there because you might know that I'm thinking about 1 Timothy chapter 5, and 1 Timothy chapter 5 talks about the idea, when we just read a second ago, of those who don't provide for their own. But I want you to look for just a second. I'll tell you what, I'll throw the verse up here. And 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 4, if a widow has children, but look at this, children or grandchildren. The Bible is suggesting to us here that both children and grandchildren are obligated by the institution of the family to show piety at home and repay. This is good and acceptable before God. Did you catch that? Children and grandchildren. You know, it was a time in the past where the relationship with grandchildren and grandparents was a lot tighter because typically we lived close to one another. But now as society, we've moved away from each other. We've kind of gotten away from that. We need to understand that as disciples of Christ, one of the important things we focus on is upholding these ideas. And one of the most important ideas the Bible wants us to understand is to honor our father and mother. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 speak to the importance of that commandment, to honor our father and mother. There's a great example with Joseph. Whenever in Egypt, Joseph goes out and becomes the prime minister of Egypt, the Bible tells us that he brought his father there. And one of the big ideas was that he went to his father and said, "Father, I'm going to take care of you." What a great example. Joseph, by the way, Joseph is a fantastic example of multiple things about family. Forgiveness, we're going to talk a little bit about that as we come along. His relationship with his brothers, siblings, the difficulties that come up. In about 4 classes, we're going to talk about that some more. But we don't oftentimes appreciate that Joseph is a fantastic also example of the honor a son is meant to give his father, that his desire was to see to the needs of his father. That's a tremendously important idea and a part of that institutional concept of the institution of the family. Here's another one to consider. How about Mordecai and Esther? When we consider Mordecai and Esther, they have kind of an unusual relationship. This is actually one of the few times where we have a family where there's not married parents involved, that instead it's the idea of a family where it's a man who's bringing up a girl, and it doesn't indicate necessarily that he has a wife. In Esther chapter 2, it tells us about that in Esther chapter 2 in verses 6 and 7. So the idea is that here's another example of a relationship between two cousins where Mordecai took in and took care of, raised Esther. There's an important family illustration of how a family is meant to operate and work with one another. Let's go on. Here's another one to consider. How about nieces and nephews to aunts and uncles? Well, a great example of that is Abraham and Lot. How it was that Abraham took care of Lot. How he saw to his needs as best he could until they divided themselves the land. The idea is that Lot was raised and perhaps I'd like to think maybe had some spiritual supervision in his relationship with his uncle Abraham. Here's one more to consider. How about adoptive relationships? Here's a great example of an adoptive relationship. David adopted Mephibosheth. You know, it's kind of interesting. Mephibosheth probably wasn't a child. Whenever he was taken in by David, but we read that David adopted Mephibosheth, who was a son of Jonathan, and brought him into his home and seated him at his table and made sure that his needs were taken care of. I bring up all these relationships so that we can kind of come back and answer that question, what is a household? And I see I got some great answers already. I want to grab a couple of those for just a moment. First of all, I've got Wendy Haynes, and Wendy says the following: a group that you are responsible for, as small as those that live in your house or as broad as the members of the church. Wendy, thanks for that comment, because Ephesians chapter 2 talks about the church, the local church, as the household of God, and speaks about our responsibility to him. So Wendy, that was a fantastic comment for us to see there. Here's Monique. Monique says, in answer to the question, take your children everywhere with you, involved in... I want to hold on to that because that's coming up for the next question. I'm sorry. So the idea here is, what we're seeing is a household, from what the Bible is describing, to take care of your household can be a pretty broad definition. It can be nieces and nephews and cousins and grandparents and aunts and uncles. It can be a broad range of people that there might be some obligation that we have, according to the institution of the family, to take care of. I want to plug that idea in to your discipleship mind, okay? Plug the idea in that the institution of family, which begins with marriage, which is designed in part to launch people into marriage, has within it the idea that we are to take care of the household, and that the household is a very broad idea. Well, in what ways can we teach this idea of the importance of caring for the family? And that's where Monique gave me an answer. She said to take your children everywhere with you, involved in helping and caring for others, whether meals, rides, calls, etc. And Gregor kind of gives an endorsement of that idea of a good behavior. I just want to say something personal, that one of the things that impressed me growing up was that I had, when I was in my teens, my grandmother became unable to take care of herself, and so she was brought into our home, and this was my mother's mother, and one of the things that impressed me most in my life growing up was to watch the care of my father, who was not her son, but her son-in-law. My father had for her. And that lesson stuck with me in a tremendous way. It really latched into the idea of how important it is that this institution's honor remain intact and that we take care of those that are attached to our household. You know, we've all seen examples like that. We've all seen people who took care of people. We know of those who, just until recently, somebody taking care of her sister and always watching out for her and checking on her every day. Lots of relationships like that. Lots of relationships with people who are listening right now have had with people that have revealed that. Those are examples of how we teach. And Monique was kind of making a point to say one of the great things we're doing is that we're teaching our children this idea too. We're teaching our children of how important it is that they're caring by having them participating in these things. I've often said one of the worst things that we say as parents to adult children is we say things like, I don't want to be a burden to you. That's a terrible thing to say. Well, it's terrible. It's not a good thing. Because the point is, we're supposed to be burdens to one another. If we're not, how do we fulfill Galatians 6:2? To bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If I'm not going to give you a burden, I tell my kids all the time, I plan to burden you guys. I'm going to do it. They usually say, you've been doing it. But the point is, I want them to know that it's not just going to be, I'm going to let you take care of me if it's easy. They need to understand that that's how this institution works. Now, first and foremost, they need to see it in me. I need to have that kind of care for those that are in my family institution. But I also set that expectation that they're going to do it for me. And by doing this, they're going to be able to fulfill the law of Christ. How do you get to heaven? You fulfill the law of Christ. If we don't share each other's burdens, then maybe we should be worried about whether or not we can actually engage in a way that we can inherit eternal life. Let's go on in our subject here. The biggest idea that I think we're supposed to get out of this is not really the point we've been focused on, but I think it needs to be addressed. One of the big ideas, perhaps the most important idea here, was the conflict of Cain and Abel. This is the first time something like this happens in human history. And it's terrible. And, you know, I've wondered a lot of things about this. For example, I've wondered, is it possible that Cain and Abel, maybe they hadn't witnessed death yet? Maybe what Cain did, he doesn't even know what it means for something to die. I'm not sure. I'm not sure even how Abel was offering sacrifices. It almost seems like in Genesis 9, they hadn't been eating meat yet. So I'm not sure what he was doing tending these flocks. There's a lot of things here I don't really understand, and I wonder about, I speculate about, but I don't really know. But I do know the Bible wants us to understand the characteristics that surround strife between close people. The things that surround strife between close people. And the idea might be the sense that on the one hand, we have Abel, and Abel is the man who's offered God the sacrifice God accepted. And then we have Cain. And there's an important statement made about this sacrifice in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. It says to us that by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. And through it, he, being dead, still speaks. So here we have a statement made about Cain and Abel, and it's telling us that Cain is the person of faith to consider. Abel is the person of the world to consider. Oftentimes what we say here is that one of the important lessons we got out of this early moment was the idea of what it is that we bring to God. In fact, let me step back a second and say, here's the idea. The witness of righteousness is testified by the gifts, right? You see that there, right? Through which he obtained witness, which is the idea of a testimony. He obtained witness that he was righteous. What was it that testified? God testified of his gifts. That he offered God the things he was supposed to offer. What is that? The things God desires. This is a Bible 101, Disciple 101 kind of concept. That the big deal in Genesis 4 around a family and around what they bring before God ultimately points to the idea that Abel offered God what God desired, and Cain offered God what Cain desired. And that's an important idea because I think that's one that we see a lot today. Let's take a second and ask a couple of questions that maybe don't really have good answers here. Here's the first one. What do you think about Cain? What is it in Cain that drove his actions? What is it in Cain that made him the person that he was? You know, it tells us in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 12 that Cain was the wicked one that murdered his brother. It says, why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Now, one of the very important things that we want to consider here is the idea that in the first family, what we see is a righteous and an unrighteous person. And the strife that will create to have the righteous and the unrighteous in a family together. Now, Cain and Abel, the fact that Cain is deemed unrighteous, Abel is deemed righteous, it doesn't separate the idea that they're brothers. So the family unit doesn't fall apart because somebody's not righteous before God, but the family unit is torn apart whenever there is unrighteous conduct in it. This speaks very much to the concept that its institution is divine, that God himself is the one that creates and establishes this institution, this idea. The question is, why did he do it? I've got a lot of great answers here. Anna puts down jealousy. Good one, Anna. It seems like that does seem to reach into what we read in Genesis chapter 4 when it gives us a sense of what might be going on here. It's kind of interesting. Anthony throws out pride. Now, Anthony, what's interesting about that, in Jude verse 11, it kind of throws the idea that there are some that have gone in the way of Cain. They've run greedily in the error of Balaam, perished in the rebellion of Korah, that it ties Cain's sins to Balaam and Korah, and that certainly would fit the idea of pride. So pride fits there nicely as well. Ben kind of gets down to the point. He says anger. Ben, that's such a good answer. I actually want to bring the verse up just a second to remind us of what's going on there when we consider these things, that what we're seeing here, let me jump back there for just a second, that what we're seeing here is anger is the statement that's made. Cain was very angry. In our study of Ephesians, we're going to be coming to a statement here in the next, this coming Sunday, we're going to talk a little bit about anger. James will tell us that the anger of man doesn't accomplish the righteousness of God. Anger is a dangerous and deadly emotion. There's an important idea here that we're supposed to consider, and that idea is that anger leads us to a path of self-destruction. Stephen James, I want to follow up with his statement here when he reminds us what's going on, that God said, if you do not do well, sin's crouching at the door. Its desires for you. So that's a profound idea. Actually, as we consider this point, we're really seeing a profoundly important idea. Debbie Watkins throws us another idea. She says, well, what if it's laziness in part? It's easier to gather a few veggies than to prepare the animal enough to get the fat. Debbie, that's a great observation. As a kid, I can remember a lot of times that point was made in Bible classes. They'd say, look, what a sacrifice is. What do we know about sacrifices, Debbie? Well, we know that a sacrifice is supposed to cost us something. It's supposed to be a sacrifice, in other words. David would teach us about that when he teaches about sacrifice by telling us you can't offer God something that doesn't cost you anything. And perhaps, again, Genesis chapter 4 is laying the basis for a lot of different ideas, family and how to worship God. And it has to cost us something. It has to be valuable to us for it to be valuable to God, for God's desire there. So Debbie, that's a great comment. Got another comment here from Gregor. Gregor says Cain was jealous, selfish. God mentions that Cain's countenance had fallen. Literally, his face turned from God. You know what's interesting about that statement, Gregor, is I think about the idea of his countenance falling. Sometimes I use this idea of countenance being like depression. that part of the idea of his anger was also a manifestation of a depression, that he was really sad, and that's where his anger got the best of him. And I think it's interesting because we'd always think about, letting our countenance fall being a dangerous thing, but it absolutely can be just that. So we have some good statements here. Rob Wade gives us one more. He sees stubbornness. Rob's been reading Jordan Peterson again, and that's a good point. That is an interesting observation, the idea of the stubborn and willful child. In fact, that writer I mentioned there writes a lot about Cain and Abel as a family dynamic of the different kinds of people that emerge within a home, of the person who's stubborn, who resists doing the right thing. God's trying to guide Cain, to get Cain to come back. He says, hey, this is what you need to do. Get back on track. And Cain resists. Cain's pushing back from that. So we really get a good sense of all these different characteristics. Let me ask one more question, and then we're going to wrap up our time together. The last question I want to put out there to you, Gregor is going to throw this one up for you. What do we make of God's warning to Cain? We're really at our time. Someone would have rung the bell at me at the building by now, but let's just say one last thing. What do we make of God's warning to Cain? And actually, tell you what, let me just answer it for us since we're really at our time tonight. What do we make of God's warning to Cain? God's warning to Cain is it's all within your control of what you're going to do. Even when our emotions are driving us out of, to act in different ways, we never truly lose total control. We let ourselves lose control, but ultimately we don't lose control. Anthony throws out Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14 that reminds us that every action we do will fall into judgment for. And a lot of times even those things that are not sinful will lead us into sin if we do not take control. So as we wrap ourselves up, talk about our first family tonight and the things that we saw in the first family. What we saw here was the idea that God, by creating marriage, created the place where a family would begin. And the part of the purpose of the family is to change it. It's to propel the children of the home outward. But of course, we said that a family, really, the idea of a household can be defined in a very broad way. Relationships that are very strong and stretching, and cousins and uncles and things like that. And all of these bring about our obligations. Within the family, when people aren't behaving righteously, it does great damage to a family. In fact, one of the biggest lessons we're going to learn out of this next 13 weeks of classes is the idea that unrighteous conduct has some of its greatest damage within the family. And that we need to appreciate that idea of the great damage that unrighteousness brings to the home. Well, that's all the time that we have. We're a little bit over, and I appreciate you still staying tuned for just a couple of minutes, but we'll wrap up here. Next Sunday at 10 a.m., we're going to continue our Bible study in the book of Ephesians. We'll invite everybody to come join us for that. And then, of course, at Wednesday, again, we'll be continuing on this study. We'll have more material on our website, and you can always access that material and look at it at any time. Thanks so much for all the things that you've spent with us on these things, and may God bless you in this new week.